On the list of things Canada will get around to, interprovincial trade barriers? Sure, yeah, someday. This frustrates people like Mike Holden. Like one time, he had a meeting in Ottawa.
And the minister had a collection of construction hard hats on her desk. And each one was from a different province. And no one province would accept the construction site hard hat from any other province.
Harmonizing hard hat rules won't protect us from U.S. tariffs. But could it help? Hi, I'm Paul Havershood. Welcome to The Cost of Living. Canada's talked about removing interprovincial trade barriers forever. And as much as everyone seems to think now is finally the time, it could be easier said than done. Speaking of which, buying Canadian feels like it should be straightforward. But what if it's made here and owned there? Or grown there but processed here? Or assembled here but, well, yeah, you get the point. Up first on this all tariffs all the time edition of the show, former Bank of Canada Governor Stephen Poloz. Anyone else feel like this year has already been 400 days long? In just the last 2 weeks, Trump has threatened tariffs, yanked them back, put them on steel and aluminum. Now we're in limbo as he decides what to do next. Stephen Poloz has seen it almost all in his career and helped guide the country through some pretty uncertain times. He's a former governor of the Bank of Canada and now a special advisor at the law firm Osler. Hi there.
Hi there.
Let's start with your worry meter. Where's it at right now?
It's pretty far up there. I've never seen so many threats or risks or indeed volatility. There are just so many angles that are problematic that I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like this. And it's not going to be an easy thing to somehow figure this out and move on from it.
How well is Canada set up to handle this?
Not that well, to be blunt. The economy right now is in a sort of a lackluster phase, let's call it. Investment's been weak for quite some time. And this shock that's being threatened on us is truly foundational. I mean, our entire economy is built on trade, and within that, mostly built on trade with the United States. And that backbone is under threat.
This is maybe not the rousingly cheery start to our conversation that I was maybe hoping for. I didn't know what you were going to say, but I was kind of crossing my fingers like, hey, maybe Stephen Poloz will be like, we're okay. Not so much.
Not so much. Back in 2020, they called me Sunny Steve because I said that the Canadian economy would be resilient to COVID. This time, though, since the shock is not in any way transitory, it's foundational, assuming it unfolds. I mean, of course, we don't really know how it will go from here. But if it is, then we need significant adjustments down below in order to move forward from it.
All right, well, if we do get this tariff shock and the tariffs stick around, both ifs, what does Canada's economy look like, do you think, in year one of tariffs, year two of tariffs, and so on?
So none of us should be definitive about this. This is outside the scope of any modeling that economists do. So with that caveat, you can kind of do the math, and it would take, sort of around 5% of our GDP. So think of it as a 5% cut in everybody's paycheck.
5%? Like, what does that mean for our standard of living?
Well, it would mean, for instance, let's say the economy is growing 1% right now, maybe picking up a little bit of speed. Then we would lose 2.5 points off of that. And then next year, another 2.5 or 3% shrinkage in the economy. And after that, the economy could resume its growth rate, let's say of 1, or perhaps if we were lucky, 2%. But the important thing is that the 5 percentage points I talked about earlier would be gone forever. The level of our income would be lower forever. But the one thing that people aren't really talking about is that the exchange rate is very likely to move, and it could move a lot. And imagine, just to simplify the example, that if I'm selling to this American buyer, suddenly there's a tariff of 25%. And suppose, for sake of argument, the Canadian dollar depreciated by 25%. Well, it would be as if it never happened, right? I would still be selling to that person in the US, and that person in the US would be paying a 25% tariff, but the US dollar would be 25% more powerful. And so his extra cost would be absorbed by the stronger US dollar. The problem is that then everybody else in Canada also has a depreciation in the Canadian dollar, and everything that we import in Canada now costs 25% more. So that is how the thing can get spread around, and that's why the answer to your question is so complicated, and we really don't know how it will turn out. But I think the main thing is that people aren't discussing what if the exchange rate depreciates by 15 or 20%, and American consumers don't see the inflation that we're predicting.
And of course, if they're buffered, that means that potential counter tariffs, Canada's retaliation, isn't being felt in maybe the way that we would hope in the U.S. I mean, how do you feel about the idea of retaliatory tariffs then?
Yeah, so basically the impact is doubled when you retaliate. And so that's one of the paths forward might be to say, wait a minute, if we can't win, why are we retaliating? It's just going to cost us more. Let's find another way to adjust our economy, and it could be the exchange rate does all the work. And afterwards, then we build our economy up in markets, where we can sell, where we have a free trade agreement almost fully ratified with Europe. We have free trade agreements with other major economies, so we can still grow our international business. And we may still be able to have good business in the United States at a lower exchange rate to compensate for the tariffs. So now I think you're starting to see just how complicated this is. You know that economists can make anything more complicated than it looks. And I'm not really different from that. We honestly don't know. And of course, what we really should try to do is find out what it is that the United States really wants from us and see if we can find a path there.
You've mentioned the word resiliency a couple times. Are there things that we could start doing now that we're not doing, or maybe we need to get on doing, that would make us less vulnerable?
Well, I think so. Look, we have not been that competitive for some time. Our investment in our own businesses has been weak for pretty well a decade now, which, by the way, goes back roughly to when candidate Trump, the first time around, first said that if he got anywhere near the White House, he would tear up NAFTA. And at that time, investment in Canadian companies began to flow south. Not every dollar, but a lot more investment flowed south. Companies began to build their own resiliency by having operations on both sides of the border, and that was making them more naturally hedged against exactly what's occurring today. So that's in a way a good news story, because here it is, and companies themselves are going to be more resilient to this shock than they would have been the first time around. That doesn't necessarily play that well to our audience here, because it means that the Canadian companies have created jobs in the United States, and they're saying, well, the company is resilient, but the employees on the Canadian side may not be protected, right, from the reasons we've already discussed. And but there's an element there. We have over $1 trillion. Canadians have over $1 trillion of assets invested in the United States today, far more than Americans have invested here. And so that is a form of resilience. But what we want to make sure that happens now is that whatever the headwinds are to investing here in Canada, We need to find policies that are good enough and aggressive enough that they overwhelm those headwinds and make it sensible for companies to invest in their business here.
Well, then finally, if I could get you to return for a moment to the days of Sunny Steve, is there one thing you could point at right now in this very uncertain moment you think, hey, you know what? Canada's got this going for us.
Yes, I am still Sunny Steve. And the main thing that gives me that kind of positive outlook is technology. We are just now beginning the fourth industrial revolution, which is the digitalization of everything we do and the overlay of AI, which gives that sense of cohesion to the digital revolution. So people ask questions like, "Oh, the AI thing, is that real? Like, is it going to really produce anything?" Because they look at the stock price of companies that have invented AI. That's the wrong thing to look at. What happens for every industrial revolution is the people that invent the new technology make money at the beginning, and then maybe they have a bubble in their stock market. But what happens in the next stage is that everybody else uses that new technology. So it's the deployment phase where all the real money is made. And that stage is just getting going. And so Canada, has some of the best IT people, the best IT companies. We've got the people that are driving the actual tech equipment, the supplier, the whole supply chain is here. There's a lot of things we can do to make that whole ecosystem stronger and tap into it better. But the main thing is for all our companies to tap into it now and realize a 10, 15, 20% increase in productivity, which will generate wealth for all of us to share around. That, I think, is the key to resilience, and we know we can do that.
Well, Stephen Poloz, thank you so much for all of that.
It's my pleasure.
On your radio and by podcast, this is The Cost of Living. I'm Paul Haberstrood. Buy Canadian. That's straightforward enough, right?
A whole lot of Canadian pride goes into what we do at Kraft. There's real Canadian wheat and cheese in this box of KD, and 100% Canadian dairy in this Philadelphia cream cheese. The peanuts in Kraft peanut butter, roasted right here in Canada.
Okay, we see you, Kraft, wrapped up in the maple leaf. But based in Chicago, your biggest shareholder, the Oracle of Omaha, Warren Buffett. On the other hand, those peanuts are roasted right here in Canada, and they have 1,000 people working at a factory in Montreal, which can really muddy the waters, Blair Sanderson finds, when all you want to do is not buy American.
Hello.
Hi.
How are you doing?
I'm good, thanks.
Bonnie Phillips is loading groceries into her car outside a Safeway in Calgary. I'm giving her a hand because I'm nice, and I also want to know what she's buying.
Well, I've been doing some research, so I look for product of Canada, or local, as much as possible.
But Bonnie isn't just about buying Canadian. She also doesn't want to buy anything from the United States.
I'm also looking for things, especially produce, from other countries, like Mexico or some Central American countries.
It's not as easy as it sounds.
So here I have some frozen corn. Do you want to take that out of my arms there? Just grab the frozen corn.
This is a test, I see.
Uh-huh.
Okay.
So just take me through what you think where the corn might be from.
Well, it's prepared for Mississauga, but that really doesn't tell me where the corn is grown.
And unfortunately, for Bonnie, that's just the way it is. In most cases, Canada doesn't require companies to say where their food imports come from. So, a label might say, made in Canada with imported ingredients, or prepared with some imported ingredients. But where those ingredients actually come from is often a mystery.
You wouldn't know one piece of corn from another.
Rob Kreklowitz is a lawyer in Toronto who knows all about this stuff. He specializes in customs and international trade, and he believes Canada could do better.
Yeah, I think if you're asking consumers to make an educated decision, it's important to give them the information that they need to make an educated decision, and making changes to our labeling requirements to actually specify origin of the goods is probably a good idea.
And there is a lot of sympathy for that idea, especially right now.
I think what we're seeing is sort of a really unique animosity to the U.S. that's different from just that sort of patriotic buying Canadian.
Mike Von Masso is a food economist at the University of Guelph.
We don't have a beef with Mexico, so if you want to buy a Mexican avocado, feel free. We don't have a beef with Peru, so if you want to buy green beans or blueberries from Peru, feel free.
But that can mean a lot of guesswork for country-conscious consumers. Our food systems are just so complex. It's not practical to require country of origin labels.
I can give you an example of a Canadian company, Canadian workers, making salsa here in Ontario.
In the summer, they use Ontario tomatoes and onions. But in the winter,
the tomatoes might be coming from somewhere else, so that product is Canadian at some times of the year, but it's not always Canadian, so it won't say Canadian on that.
Mike says if companies were forced to list where their ingredients come from, they'd have to change labels all the time, adding extra costs. And it might prompt them to buy only American, just to avoid the hassle.
You have to kind of weigh, the jobs in Canada versus the imports.
Bonnie wishes she did know more about where her groceries come from. She's not buying frozen corn right now. She doesn't want to take the chance it's from the U.S.
But if you knew that the corn was from Mexico, for instance, would you buy it?
Then I would buy it, yes.
And so what do you make of the fact that that information isn't there? Would you like it to be?
Yes, I would, yes.
But for now, that's just not on the menu. For The Cost of Living, I'm Blair Sanderson.
This is The Cost of Living. I'm Paul Haberstrood. Now, if you wanted to get zen about Trump's tariffs, which admittedly is pretty hard to do, well, you could say, hey, we can't control what anyone else does, only what we do. And one idea that's now everywhere is to get rid of interprovincial trade barriers. Yeah, that's the ticket. Boost the economy by doing more business with ourselves. Yeah. So Jen Keane, scrapping trade barriers between provinces. How hard could that be?
I think, as it turns out, pretty hard. And there's one place in Canada where I think they understand this better than any other. Lloydminster.
Yeah, it's right on the border between Alberta and Saskatchewan.
And it was founded back when it was still the Northwest Territories, so nobody really expected that Ottawa was going to cut the city in half. But today...
we're not just grazing the border, we are straddling the border. So there is a lot of business on the Saskatchewan side and a lot of business on the Alberta side.
That's Helen Hoffman. She lives in Lloydminster, and she knows all about trade barriers. She and her husband opened the city's very first craft brewery. It's called Fourth Meridian Brewery, about 8 years ago.
The sale of alcohol is extremely strict. That highway, which I can see out my window here about 100 meters away, that's where it ends. There is no crossing it. I can go up to it, but I cannot cross that road.
And she can't cross it because
of interprovincial trade barriers. Up until a few years ago, her beer could not go straight from the brewery on the Alberta side of town to be sold on the Saskatchewan side. And this was a really big problem for her because the town's event center is on the Saskatchewan side.
Fundraisers were going on there, galas were going on there, all the big events where we had these great opportunities to showcase our beer. Couldn't get our beer there without it going through Regina. And Regina is about a 6-hour drive from us.
So to sell her Alberta beer there, she needed to first ship it to Regina.
Yeah, because out-of-province brewers are required to send everything to a central distribution center in Regina. So that would be a 12-hour round trip.
Where's the event center from her?
It's about a 7-minute drive.
I'm sure she loves this.
Oh, yeah. I mean, obviously, the shipping costs cost her more than she could make on selling the beer, so it just wasn't practical. But, there she was losing out on all that business. So every 3 months or so, she would call up the Saskatchewan Liquor Authority to try and work it out.
They essentially told me, we need to scan your barcode, and that's why it needs to go to Regina. And I was like, I know you have a way of scanning a barcode without physically having the product. Like, I can send you a barcode. I can send you a PDF. Every solution I gave to the problem, they came up with a new one that was sort of like equally as ridiculous.
Is this just like life in Lloyd?
It is. I mean, people who do business there, they're just used to this. There's different provincial taxes on both sides of town. There's 2 workers' compensation boards, so a lot more paperwork to fill out. And then sometimes the federal regulations will kick in as well. So Paul, let me tell you about what the mayor calls Sandwich Gate.
Yeah, I love a good gate. Let's go.
Okay. So there's a co-op food store in Lloydminster, and the grocery store part of it is on the Alberta side. But then on the Saskatchewan side, they also have a couple of co-op gas bars with convenience stores. They wanted to make deli sandwiches in the grocery store and then ship them to the gas bars to be sold. But they were not allowed to do that without involving the Canadian Food Inspection Agency.
Even though all of the food had previously been inspected by various whoever's.
Provincially inspected. And then the deli meat had already been inspected at the federal level. So you really get a sense for the way that these rules pile one on top of another. And in Lloydminster, they have spent a long time trying to break them down one by one. The mayor of Lloydminster actually went to Ottawa to talk about the sandwiches and asked for the rules to be waived. The best they could do was get a pilot project approved. So it took them about 2 years to be able to deliver these sandwiches from one side of town to the other.
But finally, freedom for deli sandwiches.
Viva la bologna. And not just that. Helen can also now sell her beer to liquor stores on the Saskatchewan side of Lloydminster, but only in the city limits, no further. And it took years to get that much. So, I mean, the story kind of proves that you can dismantle these trade barriers, but it also proves how much work sometimes it takes.
Yes, but if ever there were a moment to make things happen quickly, to really get this done, this tariff threat from the U.S. feels like it's providing all the motivation this country would ever need to do that.
And there is a lot to gain. A bunch of studies have been produced to try to quantify this. One says that lifting internal trade barriers could boost our GDP by as much as 7% a year.
Okay, that's a massive amount, but even if it's not that much, more interprovincial trade is something you figure could soften the blow from these potential tariffs.
Yeah, and we're looking at everything right now, right? The premiers met with the Minister for Internal Trade, Anita Anand, earlier this month. And, she really talked about how urgent this issue is and said that these trade barriers could come down in as little as 30 days.
I heard her say that, and I thought, 30 days? Anita, okay, maybe a bit aspirational?
Maybe. And so for some perspective, I wanted to talk to someone who's been steeped in this issue for a long time. Mike Holden is the chief economist for the Alberta Business Council.
One of the most challenging things with getting rid of interprovincial trade barriers is that there's not a lot that the federal government can do about it, specifically because these are all specific provincial regulations, provincial decisions, provincial policies that that they have every right to put in. I mean, any province can regulate its own roads. Provinces aren't necessarily interested in letting go of their own ability to do that.
Provinces love their provincial powers, right? It's their jurisdiction. And you can see situations where that's completely valid. Like if you have building codes in Yellowknife where they have to hold up to -80, well, should those codes be different than Fredericton where it's all humid?
Sure, that's part of it. But another part is also just good old-fashioned protectionism. As they say, all politics is local, and provinces have their own industries to protect, like say a government is building a road, and right now only local contractors can bid on it.
If you open that up to bids from other provinces, you might get a better deal. You might get, the same work done at a lower cost to the local taxpayers, but the local companies who might have gotten outbid on that contract, they'd be hurt.
Yeah, you want to do right by your local companies. Like, I can imagine a scenario where, like, provincial trade barriers come down and you're in Newfoundland, so your fish processing industry is thrown open to competition. But all of a sudden, maybe you lose some of those jobs. You lose a factory and it goes to, like, Nova Scotia.
And you have to answer to your constituents as the premier of a province, right? Your re-election may not be a slam dunk after that.
Any free trade agreement, whether it's international or this kind of an agreement within Canada, the benefits are small but widespread, and the costs are narrow and deep.
So this is something that's good for the economy at large, but like locally, there are going to be winners and losers.
And, when you look at it broadly, competition is always good for consumers. But if you are a business who's been protected by interprovincial trade barriers, things like local procurement rules, you might feel differently about the idea of tearing these barriers down. Even Helen Hoffman, who owns the craft brewery on the Alberta side of Lloydminster, she would love to be able to sell her beer into Saskatchewan more easily. But when she thinks about Saskatchewan brewers coming into Alberta,
there's got to be a balance. There's got to be a way of still protecting your in-province producers and the people like me. I still want Alberta to protect me. Don't make it so easy and level playing field that the Saskatchewan producers can now come and outcompete me in my own town.
Maybe we don't take down all the rules. Maybe we get free-ish trade, Jen?
Free-ish.
Thanks for all that.
You're welcome-ish.
That's the show. The Cost of Living is based in Calgary. The show is produced by Daniel Nerman, Blair Sanderson, and Jennifer Keane, with help from Jeff Kynock. I'm Paul Havertrude. Thanks for listening.